Welcome to Coming of Age in the Age of Tech, what parents need to know about the legal rights of their students. I'm Krista Bauman. Let's face it, today's parents face a unique challenge, navigating a social media landscape that they never experienced as kids and trying to guide their own children on how to use social media as a tool. And if that weren't tricky enough, the reality is that even a well-meaning post on Instagram or video on TikTok can easily be misunderstood, sometimes leading to real-world consequences at a child's school, including expulsion or discipline. As a First Amendment and due process attorney, I've witnessed the fallout at the intersection of teens, social media use, and school discipline. I've prepared this video to discuss how these issues are playing out in school and to equip parents with the tools they'll need to help their children navigate the worst if it arises. First, some context. What kind of cases are we talking about here? A good example of what can go wrong at the intersection of student speech and school discipline is a case that came to me in 2020, when two young men were expelled overnight from their private California high school due to a horrible misunderstanding caused by social media. To back up, when my clients were 14-year-old boys, fresh out of middle school, and at a sleepover, they put on acne face masks that one of their moms had given them to help her son cure his acne. One mask was white and one was green, and the boys put them on and took some silly photos wearing them. Fast forward 3 years, the boys were rising seniors at their high school when George Floyd was murdered in June of 2020, causing outrage and unrest across the country. The community at my client's school was demanding punishment for other racist acts committed by recently graduated students. It was at this volatile time that someone found the innocent face mask photo of my clients taken 3 years earlier and circulated it on social media, falsely claiming that it was blackface. Under pressure to punish someone for racism generally at the school, school administrators acted overnight to expel my clients, forcing them to withdraw without giving them an opportunity to present the evidence in their favor or explain the truth about the photos. I got involved as their lawyer at that point, and we wrote a letter explaining the true nature of the photos and asking the school for an opportunity to be heard and to explain the truth of the photo to the school community. But the school refused and stood by the expulsion. As a result, my clients were shunned from their lifelong communities and suffered greatly. We decided to file a lawsuit, arguing that the school had denied my clients due process. After 4 hard-fought years of litigation and a 6-week jury trial, a jury exonerated my clients and awarded them over $1 million in damages, the largest jury verdict award that year in Santa Clara County. Despite this incredible outcome, the unfortunate reality is that the emotional harm to the boys had already been done. If you'd like to hear a firsthand account of the experience of going through something like this, including the jury trial, you can listen to my interview with one of my clients, Holden Hughes, and we'll link that in the show notes. This case exemplifies a few things. First, how speech on social media can so easily be misunderstood, particularly among young people. Second, how context can get lost in the heat of a moment. And third, how a school's decision-making process can be affected by pressure from its community to act. Since our jury trial, I've counseled dozens of families on these very issues: school discipline, expulsions, or other punishment based on misunderstandings of speech, often around social media. I wanted to share my experience with a broader audience to help families navigate and hopefully avoid these pitfalls. With that context in mind, let's talk about the realities often involved in these cases. On the one hand, you have young students who are learning as they go. They post a lot of content on social media, and they often do not communicate exactly what they meant to. They also often lack perspective for how their speech may be interpreted by others. At the same time, you also have a large community at the school of parents and caregivers. And these folks often have their own, sometimes very strong opinions about what speech is and is not appropriate for students. As we saw in the acne face mask case, The school community can often lean quite heavily on school administrators to punish those who are perceived as the offenders. And finally, you have the school administrators themselves who have their own host of complicated issues to navigate and balance. First, they must guard student privacy and maintain the confidentiality of student investigations. At the same time, they need to account to their larger school community, which often demands answers that school officials simply can't provide. Schools typically lack resources and training on how to conduct fair investigations and operate due process principles. And schools are often working on a very short timeline to reach decisions. The reality is there are a lot of moving parts when it comes to school discipline and online speech, and the schools are not always going to get it right. So it's important for parents to understand the legal rights of their students. What types of rights your students may have will depend in large part on whether she goes to a private or public school. Generally speaking, since public schools are an arm of the government, they must abide by constitutional principles, things like free speech and due process. If your public school student is accused of misconduct, she will have a 5th and 14th Amendment right to basic due process. The extent of her rights will depend on the severity of the punishment under consideration. For example, if your child is being considered for suspension, she will have the right to notice of the charges against her, an explanation of the evidence against her, and the opportunity to present her story at an informal hearing. If she's being considered for a more extreme punishment, such as expulsion or long-term suspension, she's entitled to written notice of the charges against her, a formal hearing with the opportunity to present evidence, call witnesses, and potentially also have legal representation, and in some cases, a right to appeal, depending on her state or school district policies. The situation at private schools is a little different because private schools are not a branch of the government and are not bound by constitutional standards. Student due process rights at private schools would stem, if at all, from contract or tort or other legal theories. One legal theory for student due process rights is breach of contract. Most private schools are going to have a student-parent handbook. And sometimes these handbooks will outline what process is necessary when a student is accused of misconduct or how a school will handle its investigations. Courts may intervene if a school acts arbitrarily or if it fails to follow its own rules in the handbook. Another source of due process rights, potentially, for kids at private schools is a common law right. In other words, a right created by the courts and judges. Some states recognize that there is significant harm when a student is deprived of their education arbitrarily. California is one of the states to recognize a common law due process right. And in 2023, the California Supreme Court decided in a case called Bormeister versus Carey that there are certain basic standards for what fair procedure looks like at a private university. These include adequate notice of an alleged violation, and a meaningful opportunity to be heard and present their position. This common law due process right is the right that we litigated in the Acne face mask case. And the jury agreed with us and awarded my clients damages and exonerated them for what they were accused of having done. In fact, our case was the first to expand these due process protections from university students to private high school students. And we hope that the precedent we set will help many other families in the future. Finally, your private school student may have due process rights under federal law, specifically Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This act applies to private schools that receive federal funds and provides limited due process protections for students with disabilities, for example, where accommodations are denied arbitrarily. So these are the legal rights your student has by law. To close, I'd like to go over some practical tips that you might consider if your student is accused of misconduct at her school. Before school even starts, review the parent-student handbook. Familiarize yourself with how discipline is handled at the school. And if it's not clear, ask school administrators for clarification on what will happen to your student if she's investigated for misconduct. Second, as soon as you hear that your child has been accused of misconduct or is being investigated for potential discipline, ask school officials for a full explanation of what your child is accused to have done. Also, ask for an opportunity to come in to meet with school officials for a meeting to discuss before any action is taken. To the extent possible, put all of your communications with school officials in writing. If you've had an in-person meeting with a school administrator, summarize it in an email and send it to the school afterwards, ideally on the same day. If the situation escalates, consider consulting an attorney. Attorneys can help you create a clear record and can bring legal leverage to bear that will increase the likelihood that the school will take your matter seriously and prioritize a fair response. At a macro level, consider saving your valuable parent advocacy ammunition for when you really need it most. In my practice, I've seen cases where parents frequently intervene on their kids' behalf in relatively minor instances. And this can sometimes have the effect of undermining trust amongst the school officials, which can hurt chances of success down the road when you really need your advocacy to count for your child the most. On a less legal and more social emotional level, keep in mind that students in these situations feel like their entire world is falling apart. I've had so many tearful meetings in my office with young people who believe that their world is in shambles because, in fact, their school community can be their entire world. Remind your student that they are not alone, that this type of thing, regrettably, is happening to kids just like them all around the country every day. And consider sharing with your child my interview with Holden Hughes, the young man from the acne face mask case. Holden does a beautiful job explaining these issues and the impact they can have on students from the perspective of a young person who has recently gone through it. I hope this presentation helped you and gave you some insights for navigating the challenging job of being a parent in today's age. For more information and resources on student due process rights, check the show notes and follow me on LinkedIn, where I often post about these issues. And if you found this episode useful, please share it with someone else you think it might help. I'm Krista Bauman. See you next time.